Ollie from flightcomp, back for another Vertigo install video. Finally going to get around to doing the flaps. So here's my center panel on the workbench. As you can see, first thing I'm going to do is prep my servo frames. If you choose to use the supplied frames that come with the kit and the servos, you have to do a little bit of work to the frames to get them to go in. Very minor stuff. Just take a round file, this is kind of like a half round file, and you're going to want to just clean up the bearing hole a little bit because it is 3D printed and there are layers and imperfections in there. So just go in here and clean up the hole. And also I took the flat side of the file and just went on these edges just to take off any burrs and imperfections. And then you're going to want to sand the bottom really good, scuff up the bottom really well. And that's about all you need to do on these bearings, or the frames. Here are the servos. And again, we're going to use just the plastic method. We're going to cut a sheet of plastic and put it between the servo and the frame before we push these in. So next thing I'm going to do is prepare my servo horns, and then we can get the servos into the frames and see where we need to align them in the servo bay here. Okay, here's what the servo looks like when it's all installed in the frame. There's a little plastic bushing and a screw, and there's a washer under the head of the screw, and just some plastic, a little bit of plastic baggy material here to keep the servo from getting glued to the wing. And then the distance from the hole to the center of the output shaft is 6 millimeters, so quite a short horn. Put it down here, you might be able to see. Anyway, pretty short horn. I had to drill that hole. It wasn't one of the pre-drilled holes on the servo arm. But anyway, that's 6 millimeters. And then now we're going to figure out where we want to place it in the servo bay. Okay, did some measuring and we're getting closer to being able to glue in the control horns. I have measured 10 millimeters from the edge here. This actually isn't very critical because it's a hollow molded center panel, and it's a big servo bay, so plenty of room in here even if you were to use a bigger servo. And on the flap there's a lot of carbon reinforcement and a big patch top and bottom, so you can wander off either direction, not a problem at all. I have 10 millimeters, you could be 8 or 12 or 6 or whatever. So I've done the usual. I've marked this line all the way back to the edge of the flap and continued it onto the top. As you can see right here, and I've filed a slot through the sub-trailing edge to accept the control horn. So that slot is on this line, and then what I've done is measured 2 millimeters over and marked this line, and this is where we're going to put the slot for the linkage going to the servo. So that's outboard of the panel. You could go inboard. Again, this stuff isn't critical. And I've cut a slot through the sub-trailing edge. Hard to see, but it's in there. And the tools to use for this are just files. These are this is a diamond coated file, flat on both sides, pointy end, and this is a steel file, same shape, pointy on the end, and also an X-Acto knife. I just barely started the slot with an X-Acto knife and then pressed down and punctured through the sub spars with the file, and then just started working back and forth. Slow and steady, do not rush, don't use too much pressure, and you'll come out with some good slots. Now on the slot for the control horn, you want to make sure you get down to the bottom skin and up to the top skin. That way the control horn will fit, and I'll show you how that's going to look. So this is how it's going to look basically before we glue it in. We're going to want to align the hole, actually it's going to be slightly forward of the hinge line by a few millimeters. So you want to be slightly forward of the hinge line, and that way we're going to get the correct amount of down travel. So basically if you put, I think I can do it better on the bench. So basically if you put this edge about 2 millimeters rear of the hinge line, let's say this is the hinge line, you want the control horn to look like that. Maybe this will show you better. So if the edge of this ruler was the hinge line, this is how this is going to go into the control surface. About 2 millimeters behind the hinge, and that'll put the hole about 1, maybe 1.5 millimeters forward of the hinge line. Okay. So in preparation to glue the horns in, I've put some notches with a file on the edges and sanded this area up really good with really coarse sandpaper. Still need to do that to this one. And actually I've only set up one side. The other side isn't done, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this setup onto the other side, cut all my slots, and then I'm going to epoxy in both control horns. Alright, I've prepped both horns and I've made linkages for both flaps. Servos are ready. Just for your reference, I am mounting these servos with the horns facing the trailing edge just because I would like to keep these linkages as short as possible in the hopes that they wouldn't bend as easily. Maybe if we drag the flaps. If you have a strong model, you may want to consider putting an LDS system on the flaps or trying to put clevises and threaded rods on here, but it would be really difficult because the horn length is so short. So I think if you have a strong model, maybe an LDS system would be the way to go. Or you can use the same setup and put a carbon sleeve, glue a carbon sleeve over the rod. That might be the better way to go. So, just for your reference, if you're going to use these servos and frames, the length of my rods from center to center is 62 millimeters, center to center. And you can be up or down on that a few 1 millimeter or so. It won't make much of a difference. I just made sure that I could get access to this rear screw coming down like this. Yeah, so we are actually ready to epoxy these into the flaps. Alright, epoxy is mixed. Slightly thicker than mayonnaise, I'd say. And it has some Cabosil and a little bit of microballoons. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the slot behind the sub-trailing edge first with epoxy. I'm going to push the horn in with the rod attached. And then I'm going to get the horn in place and tack the front of it in with just one drop of CA using a T-pin. That way, when it's fixed in position, after that, I'm going to then apply epoxy around the front face of the sub-trailing edge. Here you can see that the slot is filled up with epoxy. I've done this on both sides. Now I'm going to push the horns in and then tack them down with CA. All right, you can just barely see a drop of CA or super glue right under the front edge of the control horn. And that's just going to hold it in place while we apply some more epoxy. And now you can see we've applied epoxy on the front edge of the sub spar on both sides of the horn. Make sure you don't get any on the hinge line and you don't get any on your linkage, and if you do, just take a pin or an X-Acto knife and get it off of there before this thing cures up fully. I'm going to go ahead and do the other one, and then we're just going to set this aside and let it cure overnight. One more thing here before we let this cure off. I have taped the flaps so that the flaps are in the down position. And I'm just going to set this on something with the flaps hanging off the back edge. That way, as this epoxy cures, it's going to just flow down into the flap, and it's not going to, seep up into the hinge or the linkage. So tape your flaps down, and then just set this on top of something like a box or something and let it cure overnight. Alright, well, the horns are installed in the flaps and the linkages are hooked up. The epoxy is cured. I have sanded the servo bays a little bit with some 80 grit sandpaper, and now we're just going to install the servos. We're going to do this the same way that I've done all my other flaps. We're going to tape the flaps up to our desired maximum throw, which can be about 75-80 degrees, and get the servos in position for those throws, and then we're just going to mix up our epoxy and bond the servo into the bay and put some weights on top. Alright, I got my servos installed, epoxy's cured. You can see the frame in there, and we'll just check on the servo checker real quick, see what our throws look like. So even with that really small control horn, we're getting plenty of travel. I could have actually probably made that even maybe a ½ millimeter shorter, maybe on the next one. So the next thing I got to do is glue in my connectors on the roots here. And my plane didn't come with the wires installed, so I had to install them, but yours will come with a harness and a connector in there, but I got to solder on my connector, and then we're going to put on the servo covers. We'll put some clear packing tape on the ends here, and that'll wrap up the center panel. Here's what it's going to look like before you put it in place. There's epoxy all the way around, and now I'm just going to simply put it in the slot and use some tape to hold it down. If you're curious what kind of mold release wax I use this Partol, pretty common mold release wax. You can just Google it, find it online somewhere. I use it all the time when I'm building models. So this is it here after it's taped in place. You can see the epoxy oozing out. I've just used 15-minute epoxy with some Cabosil. So I'm going to do up the other side and then let this cure for maybe an hour, and then we'll clean it up. So the epoxy's cured on this little jig, and I took the tape off, and hopefully we'll be able to pop this right off. It's already loose. There we go, pulled right off. And we have a lot of epoxy on the edges, but since we waxed this, we can just scrape it away with our fingers. As you can see. And if you want to get it really nice and clean, you can just take a straight razor like this and very carefully come down and just clean some of this up very, very carefully. So I'm going to clean this up. And this is what it looks like when it's all cleaned up. We have a nice flush mounted connector. Center panel is almost done. I'm just going to put some packing tape on the ends to protect the surfaces. Well, we got the center panel for the Vertigo finished up. I got the packing tape on the edges. And basically that completes my wing on my new Vertigo. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Doing my best to sort of spread what I've learned over the years and show you guys some of the tips and tricks I use when building models. Not the most professional video productions on YouTube, but still takes a good amount of time, and I still enjoy making them. So thanks so much for watching. You might want to consider subscribing to FlightComp if you like the videos. I have a few more videos lined up, including a couple of repair videos on composite structures. So keep your eyes out for those. But this wraps up the build videos for the Vertigo, and I will see you guys in the next one.